You wake up feeling fine. You eat breakfast. You feel fine. You sit down afterward and notice you're slightly warm. You think nothing of it. An hour later, the heat inside your body has become something you cannot ignore. Your skin is soaked. Your heart is moving too fast. Your head is collapsing inward from both sides. 2 hours after that, you're delirious. 3 hours after breakfast, you might already be dead. This is not a fever that builds over days. This is not a disease that gives you time to recognize what's happening or call for someone who might help. In Tudor England between 1485 and 1551, this was simply Tuesday. You were fine at breakfast, and by noon you were either recovering or you weren't there anymore. The English called it the sweating sickness. They didn't know what it was. Neither, 500 years later, do we. In the summer of 1485, Henry Tudor landed in Wales with an army he'd assembled in France, marched across England, and killed King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. He became Henry VII, the first Tudor monarch, the beginning of a dynasty that would reshape English history. He should have had a few days to celebrate. Instead, within 2 weeks of his arrival in London, a disease appeared that hadn't been there before. It spread through the city fast enough that 2 Lord Mayors of London died within a week of each other. The sweating sickness had arrived, apparently with the king himself, or with his soldiers, and it moved through the city like something applied rather than caught. What the survivors described was unlike anything English physicians recognized. The onset was violent and almost without warning. A person who seemed entirely healthy would develop a sudden, overwhelming sense of heat. Within hours, they were drenched in sweat so profuse it soaked through bedding and clothing. The heart raced, the head pounded, the limbs became heavy to the point of uselessness. A profound and irresistible urge to sleep descended. And here was the detail that terrified those caring for patients more than any other. If you let them sleep, they died. Physicians who had seen the disease before would spend entire nights physically forcing patients to stay awake, walking them, shaking them, keeping them moving through the sweat and the delirium, because sleep seemed to be the mechanism by which the disease finished its work. Some died within 4 hours of their first symptoms. Some lasted a day. In rare cases, people survived the first 24 hours and slowly recovered. But the window between feeling unwell and death was frequently shorter than the time it takes to send for a physician and have one arrive. There were 5 outbreaks: 1485, 1508, 1517, 1528, 1551. Between them, the disease vanished completely. No simmering cases, no reduced version, no trail of infection connecting one epidemic to the next. It simply wasn't there until it was. The 1528 outbreak is the one that lets you see the disease most clearly, because by then people had been living with its periodic arrival for 40 years, because the documentary record is richest, and because it struck people whose lives were unusually well recorded. Henry VIII, a man not given to showing weakness, fled London. He moved between estates, sending away almost all his court, reduced his household to a skeleton staff, and dispatched his physicians ahead of him to each new location to certify that no one there had the sweat. He was terrified in a way that contemporaries noted because it was so visible in a man who was usually terrified of nothing. Anne Boleyn contracted it at her family's estate in Kent. At this point, she was not yet queen. She was the woman Henry was trying to move heaven, earth, the Pope, and the entire structure of European Christianity to marry. And when she fell ill, Henry wrote her a letter. It still exists. He told her he hoped she was not in as much danger as he feared, that he would willingly bear half her illness himself to relieve her, that he sent his physician because there was no better in England. The letter reveals something about the disease as much as about Henry. He expected her to be in genuine mortal danger. She recovered. Several members of her household did not. Cardinal Wolsey, Henry's most powerful minister, the second most important man in England, a man so resilient and politically durable that nothing had managed to remove him from power for almost 2 decades, contracted the sweating sickness 3 separate times across different outbreaks. He survived all 3. He considered this something close to miraculous. He was not wrong. The disease killed rapidly, indiscriminately within its particular preferences, and those preferences were strange. The sweating sickness almost exclusively attacked English people. It killed English men in far greater numbers than women. It killed adults in their prime more than the elderly. It killed wealthy people more than poor ones. It left children relatively untouched compared to adults, which inverted almost every disease pattern physicians of the period understood. That last inversion was the one that created the deepest disquiet. In an era before germ theory, physicians explained disease through the theory of humors, imbalances in the bodily fluids that were corrected through bleeding, purging, dietary adjustment. Children were more vulnerable, not less, because they had less robust constitutions, smaller bodies, less developed faculties. Every major epidemic the Tudor world had experienced, plague, typhus, smallpox, killed children hard. The sweating sickness preferred the vigorous, the healthy, the well-fed. It preferred exactly the people you would have assumed would survive it. The physician John Caius wrote the most detailed contemporary account of the disease in 1552, 1 year after the final outbreak. He had observed it firsthand in 1551. He described the symptoms with a precision unusual for medical writing of the period: the sudden heat, the violent and drenching sweat, the cardiac symptoms, the headache, the heaviness of limb, the delirium, the lethal sleep. He noted that the disease ran its course within 24 hours. If you survived the first day, the worst appeared to be over. He noted its preference for the healthy. He noted its near-exclusive grip on England, and within that, its concentration among English men of middling to upper social standing. He had no mechanism to offer. He described the disease the way an exceptionally careful person describes something he has witnessed but cannot explain. He categorized the symptoms without being able to say what produced them. His account is one of the most important documents we have. It is also the last. After 1551, the sweating sickness does not appear in the medical record. Not reduced, not quietly present, not occasional. Gone. No outbreak in 1558. No outbreak in 1603. No return in any form in any century that followed. The disease that had terrified the most powerful monarchy in England for 66 years simply stopped existing, as if someone had switched it off. If you're finding this story as strange as it actually is, you know where the subscribe button is. Modern medicine has had several centuries to work backward from Caius's description and the historical record and attempt an identification. The candidates are numerous. None of them quite fit. Hantavirus is the most frequently proposed explanation. Hantaviruses are carried by rodents, transmitted to humans through contact with infected rodent droppings or urine, and capable of causing a condition called hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, a rapidly progressing respiratory illness that can kill within days. Some hantaviruses cause hemorrhagic fever with renal syndrome, which produces severe sweating among its symptoms. The speed of the sweating sickness, the cardiovascular component, the respiratory element some sources hint at, these suggest a possible match. The problem is that hantaviruses don't behave the way the sweating sickness behaved. They don't preferentially target wealthy adults. They don't spare children. They don't restrict themselves to one ethnicity within a geographically mixed population. And they don't disappear between outbreaks as cleanly as the sweating sickness did, because the rodent reservoir that maintains them is always present. Influenza has been proposed. The symptoms and the speed don't match well. Typhus requires a louse vector and produces a different symptom profile. Anthrax is inconsistent with person-to-person spread. Relapsing fever produces recurrent episodes rather than single devastating strikes. Viral encephalitis doesn't explain the sweat. Each candidate finds a partial match somewhere in Caius's description and falls apart somewhere else. There's a separate line of investigation focused on the heat itself. Some researchers have suggested that the sweating sickness may have been a particularly virulent form of heat illness, essentially, a form of hyperthermia triggered by an infection that disrupted the body's ability to regulate temperature. The heavy wool clothing of the Tudor period, worn even in summer, and the closed, poorly ventilated sleeping conditions of the era could, under the right pathological circumstances, combine with an infection to produce catastrophic overheating. This might explain the wealthy dying at higher rates. They wore heavier, more elaborate clothing. It might explain the sleep being lethal, because someone losing consciousness while severely hyperthermic stops any compensatory cooling behavior. But this doesn't explain 5 discrete outbreaks separated by years without any background cases. And it doesn't explain the geographic restriction to England. A 2004 study published in the journal Medical Hypotheses by Guy and Paget suggested an arbovirally transmitted disease, something carried by an insect vector, noting that the late summer timing of the outbreaks was consistent with peak biting insect activity. This is plausible. It doesn't explain why English people, specifically, were susceptible. The most sobering possibility, the one that sits behind all the others like something you'd rather not look directly at, is that the sweating sickness was caused by a pathogen that no longer exists in its 1485 form, or that it was a pathogen that does still exist, but has evolved sufficiently that it no longer produces this syndrome, or that the reservoir that sustained it underwent a population collapse after 1551 that permanently ended transmission. Diseases can disappear. Rinderpest, once one of the most devastating cattle diseases on Earth, was eradicated through vaccination. Smallpox was eradicated, but those diseases didn't eradicate themselves. The sweating sickness did. The 1551 outbreak was, by the standards of what had come before, a moderate one. It moved through England in the summer months. It killed, as it always had, with speed and without pattern. And then in the autumn of 1551, as the season changed, it stopped. John Caius wrote his account the following year, clearly expecting it to return. He was writing, in part, to prepare physicians for the next time. There was no next time. England did not notice immediately. Diseases paused between epidemics. Plague went quiet for years before returning. The physicians and the court and the general population who had lived through the sweating sickness presumably spent years in something like background vigilance, watching summer arrive, watching the heat settle over London, waiting for the first reports of someone sweating to death at breakfast in Kent or Essex. The reports didn't come. After enough decades without an outbreak, it began to be the past rather than the present. A disease that had once been a functioning feature of Tudor life, something you made plans around, something Henry VIII organized his summer around, became a historical event, a story. Something the old people remembered. The strange thing about diseases that disappear is that they can't be fully mourned or fully studied. A disease that is still active can be investigated. Samples can be taken. Patients can be examined in real time. The sweating sickness left almost nothing biological behind. What we have are written accounts, a symptom description carefully assembled by a man who couldn't understand what he was describing, and 5 outbreak dates separated by years of silence. No one has found ancient DNA evidence of the sweating sickness pathogen. No one has found a preserved biological sample. No one has found a mass grave population that shows a characteristic bone or tissue signature that might allow identification, unlike plague, which leaves detectable DNA in tooth pulp from medieval burial sites. The sweating sickness killed its victims too fast to leave the slow biological mark that most infectious diseases eventually produce. This leaves us with something unusual in the history of medicine. Not a mystery that is simply unsolved, but a mystery that may be genuinely unsolvable with what exists. Every other major historical epidemic has eventually yielded something. Plague bacterium recovered from 13th century teeth. The 1918 influenza virus reconstructed from frozen Alaskan tissue samples. Smallpox DNA extracted from 17th century European mummies. The sweating sickness has yielded nothing. There's a question that sits underneath all the others, the one that doesn't appear in any of the epidemiological proposals or historical analyses. If this disease existed, if something genuinely killed healthy English adults in 4 hours, repeatedly, across 66 years, where did it go? Not where did the reservoir go, not what evolutionary pressure removed it from circulation. Where did it go? Because the mechanism that produced those deaths was real. The men who arrived at court healthy in the morning and were carried out dead before supper were not a rhetorical device. Anne Boleyn's household members who died while she recovered were not a historical exaggeration. John Caius was not confused about what he had witnessed. Something produced those outcomes. Something with a biology, a structure, a mechanism of action on the human body. Whatever that something was, it no longer exists in the form it had in 1551. Or it exists somewhere in a form we haven't connected to this history. Or it's still out there in its original form, in a reservoir we haven't identified, waiting for a confluence of conditions that simply hasn't presented itself since the autumn of 1551. The sweating sickness didn't leave a warning. It didn't leave a successor. It left an account written by a physician who had no idea what he was looking at, 5 outbreak dates, and a silence that has now lasted nearly 5 centuries. You are carrying a body built by thousands of years of surviving exactly this kind of thing. Diseases emerged, killed, and disappeared before anyone understood what they were. Your immune system developed its architecture partly in response to threats that no longer exist in the form that shaped it. The sweating sickness is gone. Whatever selected against it, or allowed it to vanish, or drove it to extinction, that process happened in your ancestors and produced you. Some of the people who survived those 5 outbreaks are in your direct line. That's not a comfortable thought, but it's a true one. Henry VIII, incidentally, died in 1547, 4 years before the final outbreak of the sweating sickness. He lived long enough to lose Anne Boleyn to an executioner rather than the sweat, long enough to outlive 5 of his 6 wives through various causes, long enough to become a different kind of historical horror entirely. He never saw the last epidemic. He never saw it stop. He spent decades being afraid of the wrong thing. If you want to follow the next strange chapter of what happened to human bodies through history, you can subscribe. There's a lot more of this.